Good morning, everyone. So if you pay attention to the news for the past year or so, you've probably heard a lot about the protests, about police brutality, everything going on from Ferguson and in Baltimore. But although it's been recently seen in Ferguson and Baltimore, but it's really kind of more of a historical problem. It's gone back to the 90s, 80s, back primarily in the 60s with the civil rights movement in America. But it's really happened all over the world as well. And a particular case that I want to talk to you about today happened in the United Kingdom during the 60s, 70s, and 80s. The problem with the police brutality the problem with police brutality is that it's often indicative of a larger problem within the government, typically whether it's racism inherent within the government or it's just the government turning a blind eye to a problem. And that was the case as well with the case I'm about to talk to you about. So what I want to talk to you about today is the story of Bobby Sands and the 1981 hunger strikes. What I'm talking about first is his background within the Irish Republican Army, a little bit about how he grew up and everything, and then his protests within the prison while he was contained at the Irish Mace prison in Northern Ireland. And then I want to kind of talk to you about his morality. So to start off, some background on the Irish Republican Army. It was a political movement that believes that all of Ireland should be united, a separate Republic of Ireland, which encompasses not only the Republic of Ireland that we know, but also Northern Ireland, which is one of the four kingdoms within the United Kingdom. This became a military organization focused on separating Northern Ireland from the UK and joining Ireland itself. In 1969, it would split into two sections: the official IRA, or the OIRA, which had Marxist kind of communist tendencies, and the provisional IRA, which became the main section that was actually doing battle with the UK to try and separate. And it's the provisional IRA which Sands would join during his lifetime. So a little bit more on the provisional IRA. It came to the defense of a non-violent civil rights campaign in Northern Ireland during a period called the Troubles in the 1960s. It was basically a lot of Northern Irish Catholics were being persecuted by their Protestant, by the Protestant people of both Northern Ireland and the UK as a whole. And so the provisional IRA came to their defense and organized nonviolent protests, or joined the nonviolent protests that were going on at the time. But then, when things didn't really get any better, they had to kind of up their game a little bit and become violent. So that nonviolent campaign was attacked by loyalists to the UK. They said, "Oh, well, you're not going to be able to separate from the UK. Like, just stop it," And then there were a lot of racist tendency. I don't know if racism is the right word for persecution against a religion, but there was a lot of persecution against the Catholics that made up the majority of this movement to separate. And so it was attacked by the loyalists of the UK, and eventually the UK government actually stepped in and got involved with shutting down all the movements, all the protests. But the provisional IRA, like I said, they had to come to the defense of this movement and say, well, this is right because first of all, we're being persecuted for our religion, for being Catholic, and it's just not right what's going on. But then they began mounting offensive attacks in order to force the UK to get out of Northern Ireland, and so that their agenda could continue and hopefully bring about a separate Northern Ireland and help the Catholics out in the region. And they began bombing campaigns in England and Northern Ireland against political and economic targets. There weren't really any super high profile bombings that I could really find in my research, but it was kind of sort of a guerrilla warfare sort of campaign where there was a bunch of small attacks here and there, but enough to kind of be on the UK's radar to where they were basically cracking down on anyone associated with the IRA was going to be in prison. And so I want to move now on to Bobby Sands, who was a leader within the IRA. He was born in 1959, Roman Catholic, grew up in Belfast in Northern Ireland. But he grew up having to conceal his Catholicism, which would be a primary motivator for him to join the IRA, and as well as many of his peers who joined the IRA with him, and began to believe that the UK, or the Northern Ireland, should be separate from the UK. experienced a lot of harassment because of his religion. He and his sisters would have rocks thrown at him on the way to school. They'd be spit on, you name it. I mean, they experienced any sort of harassment you could possibly you could really come up with. He left school during his teenage years to go to technical training. So basically, he could just get a job and do his job and just hopefully kind of lay under the radar a little bit and kind of get out of the persecution that he saw every day during his schooling. But once he had that job, he experienced more harassment at the job, so it didn't really get any better for him. He was held at gunpoint by a loyalist gang. His parents' house was attacked, and so basically he was in a lot of trouble. And so he finally decided that militancy was the only option. So he joined the IRA and was pretty quickly after that arrested for possession of guns, illegal possession of guns. So a really fairly minor offense, but he was sent 4 years in prison for it. And upon release, he rejoined the PIRA, the original IRA, and acted as leader on multiple bombing campaigns. Again, nothing major, but enough to really make him a target of the UK government, him and his peers. But he was eventually arrested and sentenced to 17 years in prison for these actions. But what I want to take a point to talk about that is up to this point in his life, he experienced a lot of persecution. So it basically, the only moral action that he felt that he could take, and whether or not you agree with military action like he did, whether you see it as terrorism like the UK government kind of showed it as, you can kind of empathize with his situation and say that, well, okay, if militancy was the only option that he felt that he had, then I think he acted as morally as he possibly could. While he was in prison, he and his peers also experienced more and more harassment. The guards were obviously very anti-Catholic. They were against the Irish Republican Army agenda. They treated them as common criminals. They were not realized by the UK government as prisoners of war, of which there are special rules for engaging with them within the prison. So they were treated as regular criminals, not as political prisoners, which he claimed that should have happened because they were in a war. They should have been declared prisoners of war when they were captured. But Margaret Thatcher, the prime minister at the time, said there is no political killing and political violence, only criminal killing and criminal violence. And I think to a point to an extent she has a point there. When you're taking action against your own country, you have to be careful about how you go about it. But when you're experiencing such racism or inherent persecution as was going on in the 60s and 70s at that time, sometimes you really have to take action, such as you've seen that in the civil rights movement by Dr. King, and as well as people like Malcolm X, who took a more violent approach. Routine beatings were common by the guards who, like I said, disliked their agenda. They disliked Catholicism. And it led to Sands organizing protests within the prison. First, they simply refused to wear prison clothes. They said they were clothes of a criminal, and they weren't going to wear them because they didn't see themselves as criminals. They saw themselves as soldiers fighting for what they believed in. And so, since they weren't going to be able to have their civilian clothes, they simply went naked and wrapped themselves in blankets. Next, they moved on to no-wash protests. So they would fight as much as possible as they were dragged down the hallway to the washrooms, where they were scrubbed with, pretty rough brushes just to get them somewhat clean by the guards. But they would fight the whole way there. They would fight as they had their hair cut, because they would grow really scraggly beards. They would grow their hair out, and so they would fight as much as they could to basically not be washed. And eventually it got pretty bad to where the warden would actually bring in like military soldiers to actually keep guard and actually beat them as they were being drugged down the hallways. They refused to eat food and wait for it to decompose in the corner of their cells into a moldable mush, which they would then use to form this like little crevice, which they would pour their urine out into the hallway. And they would smear their feces on the walls and use their girlfriends or wives to smuggle in tools like little wires, so where they can make like a radio so they could listen to the news about, hopefully that their situation was being read on the news and people would maybe take action. This was all necessary because the Maze prison, known as the H blocks in Northern Ireland, it was a pretty bad prison. It wasn't like the prison we think of today where inmates have a bunch of rights. They can watch TV, they can read books. They really couldn't do any of this. They were locked in their cells, which had essentially no furniture. They had a little like pad in the corner for a bed, and they didn't really have much in the way of a restroom either. So basically, they were really fighting for better treatment overall, but specifically they wanted to be known as political prisoners of war. And so Sands organized these protests against the cruelty of the guards and, like I said, to gain the attention of the general public, who could hopefully take a larger action against their situation. Writer Crader Stark, who wrote a review of the movie Hunger, which is actually based on this event, recounted being so struck by, quote, the men wrapped in blankets, their piercing eyes sunk in gaunt faces by matted hair, inescapably Christ-like and unforgettable. He recounted being so struck as that by a child. And finally, the largest and final protest that Sands would organize was the hunger strike of 1981, which would have actually cost him his life. It began with Sands on March 1st, 1981, and another one of his peers would join every 2 weeks from that point on. The purpose was to bring attention and publicity to their plight and force the UK government to meet five demands that they wrote up. One was the right to not wear the prison uniform. They saw it as a uniform of a criminal, and they did saw it as soldiers, not criminals. The right to not do prison work, the right of free association with other prisoners, and that includes like being able to go about educating themselves, like reading books, basically talking with their other prisoners. So basically, they weren't locked in their cells the whole day. They had free visit of family, mail, and parcels, or at least a certain amount every week, to where they were able to receive word of the outside world. And then finally, 5, forgiveness of any actions committed up to that point in any of their other protests. This gained little publicity at first, but soon attracted more and more media attention, resulting in Sands actually being elected to Parliament when that member of Parliament had died, so they had to do an interim election. Sands was put on the ballot, and he actually won because his struggle had gained enough media attention and attention of the public to where he was actually elected into office. Unfortunately, he would die before he actually got to take a seat, because he died from his hunger strike after 66 days. And if you've seen, I watched the movie Hunger that I mentioned earlier, and obviously it's just it's an actor, but if it's pretty accurate, and it's actually quite incredible how thin someone can get before they die. And when you're laying in bed and everything, you're not very clean, and so you develop these welts and sores on your body, and it's really quite disgusting. It's a testament to how focused he was on achieving his goal, that he was able to pull off 66 days of hunger before he would die. And unfortunately, because the UK government didn't realize these five demands, nine more men would die. None of them lasted quite as long, 66 days, but they all lasted very long, and so it's quite a testament to their focus and their drive to achieve their goal. So Bobby Sands, I would think, is kind of reminiscent of American leaders such as Malcolm X and Dr. King, through actions of both nonviolent protests as well as violent protests in pursuit of a higher cause of justice. And he wasn't fighting for martyrdom or to go down in history as a hero, but simply to fight for what he believed. Because obviously, I'm sure many of you haven't heard of Bobby Sands, but many of you have heard of Dr. King and Malcolm X, more prominent figures in civil rights history. And actions outside of prison, when he was with the PIRA, some could see as a form of terrorism, like the UK government did. And I would agree to that of some extent. But the harassment and discrimination that the Catholics and himself faced, I think, or if he saw his only action as being military, then I think he acted pretty morally. And the actions inside the prison, however, show a very resilient side of him. He wrote 2 books, one on poetry and one on his life. He actually wrote them on toilet paper, which would be published after his death. And his election to government also brings light to how the struggle, it really resonated with the public once it got media attention. And finally, Sands acted with very little power, with the very little powers he had, to both mentally and spiritually resist the situation that he was in, and bring light to the struggle of him and his fellow prisoners, and to bring about a change in the mindset of both the UK government and the public as a whole, towards the unity of both Catholics and Protestants and human rights within a prison setting. And so, with that said, I think he acted very morally, and yeah, that's pretty much it. Thank you.